drink water just so I can carry this cup around. My sister had it made for me, and it's a Yeti cup. So I know Yeti's expensive, and people can say, wow, it's super overpriced, but it keeps stuff cold, and it's glittery, and it's Georgia Southern, and it's all kinds of goodness rolled into one. But we're not here to talk about my Yeti cup. We are here to talk about the second Wendy Darling book, which I'm so excited to talk about because I loved it. And it just makes my heart happy to get to talk good things versus bad things, and especially because this is the second book in a series. So I don't know about you, but the general population, when they read a middle book, feels like it was truly filler. Like, it did not have its own independent plot, it did not resolve anything, that it was really there just to connect A to C. Because we're talking about trilogies, right? A, B, C. Get it? My first impression of Catching Fire was, we're done? Like, what did we accomplish? And that's what second books tend to do, is they don't resolve, as I said. Like, they raise more questions, and you feel like you didn't get anywhere, which is not enjoyable. But this one, so the first one followed the basic Peter and Wendy formula. This one picks up where that one left off, with Wendy and her brother Michael being rescued by Hook, who is a typical villain. Like, we only see him as Pan's arch enemy. But here, it really fleshes out who Hook is. Is he a villain? Or is he just misunderstood? Or is he neither? He's a good guy that Peter makes into a bad guy. Wendy and Michael get picked up by Hook. And they spend basically the whole book on a ship, which is a feat in and of itself. I am writing a book that takes place on a plane, and I have like an hour for an entire book. So I understand the struggle with having a very limited setting, and they don't have the time restraint that I do, but it's just really impressive to see how interesting Colleen Oakes was able to make a book that was set almost entirely in one place. So they're on this boat, and Wendy is learning about Peter. She is learning things she did not know about Peter, and so then she and Hook are coming together because she's already realized Peter's not a hero. And so now she and Hook are joining forces in trying to bring him down. I know I've mentioned that the entire book takes place in one setting, which is masterful in and of itself. But I think what elevates that is that the antagonist, Peter, he's omnipresent without actually being present. Kind of like Harry Potter. Which one is the best example of this? I would say Chamber of Secrets, except there's the basilisk. So we do have an evil entity that is currently wreaking havoc. But Goblet of Fire, I think, is a better example because it starts with a problem. You know, we know Voldemort is up to something. But there's the entire book, there's the constant presence of threat without any actual threat until the very end. And that's kind of what happens here. So not only does Oakes write a book that doesn't really go physically, the character cannot go anywhere, but she has an antagonist, a villain, who doesn't show up. Like, the whole problem is, what will he do? Is he doing something? And really, it's building up more towards the end, which is what a middle book does, is it builds up so that in the final book, you can have the final showdown without it being too large. It's fantastic how, let's see, there is one small appearance by Peter at one point, although it's debatable if it was actually him, because you don't see him, you see a shadow. Then, I think maybe there's one other until towards the end, when Wendy is going to see the mermaids, and she's actually physically approached by Peter. Outside of that, it's more about his threat than his actual presence. And I would love to write a novel just like that. I mean, that just takes so much ingenuity and creativity and skill. The book, as I said, it picks up with Wendy and Michael being rescued. They've been chained in the hull of a boat until Hook summons Wendy. And then he decides they can be allies. And what he will do is he will give her information about Pan if she gives him information about Pan. Because we've already established she knows Pan is not a hero. And her only way to get rid of him, to bring him down, is to team up with Hook. And so he begins revealing his history with Peter. Then he introduces her to other characters who are able to give her more backstory on Peter. And through this, we see that Hook, he's not a good dude. They are still legit pirates, but he's not the villain. Peter is the real villain. Let's see, I know it was partially established, like, you know, sometimes when you read things and they're so well crafted, the information just flows and you forget kind of where it met in the middle. I know in the first book you do establish that what Peter says is not always the truth. We definitely learn in Seas that he did not come to Neverland because he was one poor child of many who were subjected to a ruthless landlord or overlord. He was actually the son of that man, and he was incredibly selfish and very manipulative. And so when he came to Neverland, he started manipulating those around him. And my two biggest issues with Seas were over description. I'd read it in other people's reviews that she has a tendency to focus on surroundings for a little too long. And, you know, I'd seen that in the first book, but she definitely did a whole lot more of it in this one. I was able to move past it because I learned how to do that the first time around. But my other problem was that she did raise questions that she never really answered, and that's good and that's bad. But Peter is someone you don't know if you can believe or not. And so, like, when she tells us in the first book that he came here because his brother had kicked him into the river and he found a portal, okay. And then we learn that's not the truth, that he was actually the rich kid. So how did he come to Neverland? Like, did he fall into the river and find a portal? Like, how did he come to Neverland? As we're going through this, we are learning more about Hook. I mean, that's essentially the point of the book, is to expand on Hook. And through him, expand on Neverland and Peter Pan and just the entire world. So this was what also confused me. Is Hook, his father was not a pirate. His father was a captain, a ship captain, and they were hired by some really wealthy man to explore the furthest reaches of some Alaskan territory and bring back treasure or something like that. And they ended up getting pulled through a portal into Neverland. So that's how he arrived. And then we learn that the benefactor was Pan's father. How did his father know about that? It's never explained. Like, there are just little connective details that don't make sense to me. Because in my mind, Peter just disappeared. So how's his father supposed to know he disappeared into another realm and didn't just die, like drown, or was kidnapped or something? Like, I don't understand that. And she kind of does that, where she has raised these great questions, and then she answers a little bit of it, but then she kind of continues leaving things off. And maybe if there was not already a lore concerning Peter Pan and what Neverland is about, I wouldn't have these questions. But it's like she, in the first book, tells us that Peter brings boys to Neverland. He says he does it to help them because they are in need. And then somebody informs Wendy that Peter takes who he wants to take despite their circumstances. So I'm like, okay, well, now these boys are here as our pirates, and we already have in our head that children don't grow up, and that's why they're lost boys. Pirates are pirates because they're adults, and therefore they grew up. So Hook comes to Neverland at the age of 15-ish, and he's like 30s in the book. So he obviously aged. And we're told that Peter will get rid of lost boys / generals if they get too smart, too able, too old. Too old. So is the only reason Peter doesn't grow up because Tink gave him the power of endless youth? So everybody else in the whole community, because some of the pirates have kids. Oxley, who it's revealed his dad is one of the pirates on Hook's ship, came here at some point, and he wants to be on the ship with his father eventually, so he's going to grow into adulthood. So I'm like, we already have in our heads what's supposed to happen. So by writing this retelling, you're going to have to re-educate us on how you think this world works. Back to Oxley. In the first book, we're led to believe this is his story, but then we find out his father's a pirate, and so I know he got into Peter's gang because Hook paid off his father's debt, which meant the father had to then become a pirate, and Hook also brought in Oxley to work off his debt by being a spy for him within Peter's gang. But Oxley is portrayed as like an African tribesman, you know, with the dots and whatnot. And we're told in the very first book there's a story behind some of them, and we'll find it eventually, and we'll find out how he came to Neverland. But we never find out. Even into the third book, we never find out those little details. And I'm just like, it's very frustrating because she really engages me with her characters. So I want to know their backstories, especially because she told me she was going to tell me. Anyways, that was a completely long tangent, but it is one of the faults I found was that she didn't, in my opinion, fill out all the blanks. Wendy is on the ship. She and Hook have formed an alliance, and there are 5 ships in this pirate fleet, of which he is the head. And there is one pirate who has issues with Hook, and he wants to be the lead pirate. And so he calls a meeting, so they go to Port Duet, and that is where Wendy meets the head harlot, Fermina. Turns out Fermina was a lost girl. Peter had brought a handful of girls to the island at one point, and with his charm, he was able to kind of keep them under his thumb for a while until they realize they're basically servants. They cook, they clean, they do everything for the lost boys, but they don't get to be a lost boy. They don't get to enjoy the adventures and the fun. So they form a union, and then he doesn't kick them off the island. He flies them off the island, off Pan Island, like he did with Wendy before he dropped her. And what he does with these girls is he takes them close enough to Port Duet to drop them in the water to serve as virgin blood to feed the mermaids' dwelling. Some of the girls make it to shore and they become the prostitutes. So Wendy gets that bit of background, and this is also when she learns that Oxley is the spy. She knew there was a spy because she realized Hook had information he could not have without one. She guessed the wrong lost boy. Turns out it's Oxley. So anyways, the pirates have a meeting, and the rival captain ends up causing a whole lot of fuss and ruckus, and Hook pulls out of this 5-ship union, and he's like, we got to get moving on our plot against Pan. And so he takes Wendy and Michael to meet the Indians. So we finally get to meet the Indians. Turns out that Hook and Tiger Lily, who her name is Lomasi in the novel, they are in love, but Peter is also in love with her, and that is part of the reason that they are in hiding, because it is not safe for them, because he already, I think I discussed this, if I didn't, spoiler alert, he destroyed a race, the entire race of fairies, and so kind of to avoid that same fate, they went into hiding. And they've been in hiding for years and years and years. And so it's kind of all these little things are unraveling to show you that Hook is not a villain. He's a bad dude, but he's not a villain. Within the Peter Pan lore, we know that kind of he and Hook are nemesis, but it's all fun and games, essentially. But it's also being revealed that the games are wearing thin for Peter, and he wants to rule Neverland, which is, he told Wendy, you will be my queen, I will be the king, we will rule Neverland. And so we find out that Hook, there are many occasions he could have killed Peter, and he hadn't, because basically one thing, and that is the shadow. Throughout all this information that he and Wendy are sharing, he's like, I have one answer for you, I cannot give you until you ask the question. And eventually, she realizes the question is, what is the shadow? So the shadow is so the fairies are immortal, but when they want to move on, they would sing the song of the shadow, and the shadow would come and take them on. And Peter, for no distinguishable reason, decides he wants to get rid of the fairies. So he learns this song, and he distorts it. He distorts the heart of the shadow so that now he is the owner, the possessor of the shadow, which is how he was able to have it destroy the fairies. And so Hook continues these games because he does not want Peter to call the shadow. And if he kills Peter, the shadow will be let loose as well. Now we know that Peter is losing patience with the games, and it's all building up to the ultimate war. So we meet the Indians and leave Michael with them because it's really just not safe. And probably Oakes was like, I have nothing else to do with Michael, so I'm going to get him out of the picture for a while. And they continue on their mission. Kind of the last thing that they need to do is learn how to kill the shadow. And so that is when we meet the mermaids. So if you haven't figured out, which obviously if you've seen Peter Pan, you know they're not super sweet. They're actually really dangerous. And what they desire most is virgin blood. So obviously any virgin female blood. So girls cannot go in the ocean. But they're like, all right, Wendy, you can trade your blood for information because we think that the queen knows more than she's telling. Like, she helped Peter Pan because when Peter first arrived, he's very charismatic, and he and Hook were friends initially. And then what he had desired most, I guess, was a real father, because his father was abusive, and he latched on to Hook's father, and then he eventually demanded that Hook's father kill Hook so that he could be the only son. The dad says no, he kills the dad, and that's what sets them at odds. You know, there's a couple other things, like the whole cutting off the hand. So that sets him at odds, but then he also wheedled his way in with the mermaids. And I think they were the ones that gave him the information about the shadow. Anyways, they were instrumental in his gaining power. So now Wendy has to go and figure out how to kill the shadow, and Hook thinks they know. So she goes and she meets them, and they basically drain her body of blood before she gets out of there. But that is when Peter finds her. He's not allowed to follow her into the Mermaid Lagoon because he's a man. So she kind of gets information, but according to them, you cannot kill the shadow. But they kind of tell her where she can go to find the information. So she comes back to the boat, and she and Hook hatch a plan where she needs to get Pan's pipes. She needs to get Tinkerbell on her side because Tinkerbell, according to the mermaids, knows the song that Wendy needs to sing /play to call forth the shadow. And so the book ends with Wendy going back to Peter and just saying, hey, I was never on their side, I was just confused, I love you, blah, blah, blah. But surprise! The twist ending is that Peter has kidnapped Wendy's true love, this Booth, who I didn't really talk about at first because he was kind of sustaining force for her, but he didn't really play a major role. But Peter's manipulative, and he knows that there's got to be some way to Wendy. So he has kidnapped Booth and brought him to Neverland, and so that definitely adds an extra layer of trouble, because Wendy's like, I can't just get the pipes and get Tink, I have to save Booth. Once again, her world building was just exquisite. Yes, she went overboard with her details, but I felt like I was on a ship. I felt like these pirates were real people. I was thirsting for more. I wish she had given more information on Peter. It was really more about Hook and kind of Wendy's growth. I felt like the entire book, I felt gross and hungry. And I was like, can you please just show her having a bath and eating a meal? Like when she and Michael are first let out of the hull of the ship, they're told they have to work in order to earn their keep. And you just keep waiting for that first meal. And then they're put in the kitchens, and you're like, oh, is she going to steal an apple from the barrel? Or, she's told that, after her kitchen duty, she can eat. Well, after kitchen duty, she has to come up and help serve the pirates, but she never gets her freaking meal. Like, I just want to eat a meal. So she really does evoke, again, all of your senses. It's just fantastic. And if I were ever to write some kind of fantasy novel, or just probably something in general, I would love to be able to pick her brain, because she does a beautiful job of storytelling. My other issue, which I probably never would have noticed if I had not been physically reading it, is that there are a lot of typos and formatting issues in this book, which leads me to believe that this one was independently published. And I find that extremely surprising for someone who is a New York Times bestseller and has been traditionally published. I mean, there weren't so many, for any spelling errors, period. But I was surprised at the formatting issues. And it doesn't really get in the way of the storytelling, but it did make it problematic for me to know who was talking at some points, because she would have her dialogue, and then she would have, a sentence or two, and then she would have dialogue again, and then she would have a sentence or two, but those sentences could have come right after dialogue. They did not have to be their own paragraph. So I couldn't always tell if she was switching speakers. That's when I'm like, who was your editor? Or was that a problem that happened when they actually printed the book? That is a very, very small issue, because for me, I can handle that if it's really good writing, if it's really good storytelling. Not necessarily writing, although you can't have good storytelling without writing. I would not recommend reading it if you have not read the first one, because even though it stands alone, there's just a lot of character development and information that, while she kind of covers, I would just say it's more helpful to actually read the first one so you have better context for who people are and what's happening and why. I would love if she would write prequels. Like, I know it's not about the other characters really. The story is about Peter, the story is about Wendy, the story is about saving Neverland. But I would love to know about Peter before Neverland, or Peter, how he got to Neverland and how he began to change. I would love to know about Hook's life, I guess, coming into Neverland, maybe a little bit before, and then coming to Neverland, and how that relationship with Peter, and then how he meets Lomasi, and that is a story. There is a drama there, where it starts off great, and then, Peter's selfishness comes out, kills Hook's father, and then cuts off Hook's hand because he's having an affair with the woman Peter wants. I mean, that is a story, people. Like, I think, I would love that. So, Colleen Oakes, please, keep that in mind. I was sad to see this one end, and this was the one that I really had no familiarity with whatsoever. because I'd started with the third book. I tried with the first book, and even though I don't even know how far I got into that book, not halfway, but I was sort of familiar with what was happening in both of those, but I had no clue what was going to happen here. I knew it was more about Hook, and how basically he and Wendy became besties. They formed this bond, and in that, I loved Hook. I loved his dirty, nasty pirates. I couldn't put it down, and I should have. I should have prolonged the read, but I read the first one, probably took me a week-ish, and this one it took me, I want to say, a day and a half. I think I finished the first one, I started reading this one, I think I stayed up till midnight, so not even a day, maybe a day. Woke up the next morning and finished it. That's the hallmark of a good book, is when someone can't stop reading. So, take a look, form an opinion, and let's talk. Bye!